Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Oh, this is working. Perfect. I hope I will not provoke anyone to make a point by slamming the door. My name is Konrad, and I'm a front-end engineer at DuckDuckGo. But today, I'll tell you about my adventure with style guides, design systems, and design tooling at Brainly, where I worked for the last 3 years. And in fact, this story starts exactly 3 years ago, because it's when Brainly got a huge rebranding, and the front-end team got a huge project with a tight deadline to update all the things. And as you can imagine, everyone in the team were eager to start CSSing as soon as possible. But that's when my friend Andrzej, here pictured with his friend Brendan, suggested that we should take a step back and create a style guide first. Controversial? Yes. Risky? Yes. But was it the best technical decision ever? Absolutely. And if you don't believe me, listen on. So Brainly is a Q&A platform, but more importantly, it's software. And software tends to have technical debt. There is nothing to be ashamed of. It's a fact of life. History of technical debt at Brainly is a common one. At some point, someone decided that the current code base, here pictured with a tentacle, is bananas, and that they should rewrite the whole thing. So they did start, they haven't finished, and now engineers had 2 code bases to support instead of 1. Some years later, someone said, 2 code bases, that's bananas. Let's create a new code base that will replace those 2. And now engineers had 3 code bases instead of 2. So you see, having 3 core code bases, plus corporate website, plus a ton of smaller stuff like job posting template, etc., wasn't as straightforward to rebrand consistently as you can think. Following Andrzej's suggestion, we started by preparing a style guide. The first version we published looked rather modest. Just some HTML, CSS, and a static website showing off the components. We had a group that was called Basics. It consisted of text, colors, icons. We also had components where you can see some buttons, rating system, inputs, avatars, things like that. And finally, we had also a group called Containers. We came up with this naming ourselves. It may not ring a bell. Containers were just like bigger components that can host other components inside of them. So for example, a header or footer, bubble, box, etc. It was enough, though, to save us a lot of work and repetition during rebranding. And here, style guide is shown as a sock for some reason. I'm not sure why. Don't get me wrong, it was still a lot of work. We imagine replacing 10 different versions of the same button or 10 different implementations of the same button with the standardized style guide one. That wasn't fun. But at the end, we met the deadline, and everyone on the team credited this style guide. And that's actually a slide that I was showing when I worked at Brainly. I was showing to the new hires as an introduction to front-end. Style guide started to pay off from the day 1, but it kept on giving for the next 3 years. Firstly, once it was in place, making component-level changes was a breeze. As you can imagine, over the span of 3 years, design of the platform evolved, components were changed, added, removed, but front-end could easily keep up. So here you can see a bit of an evolution of the buttons, more buttons, less buttons, but different buttons. So yeah, over 3 years that kind of evolved, but we were able to keep up thanks to the style guide. So designers changed border radius on avatars, non-breaking change. Just bump the style guide version on all the projects, and you are done. We decided to change HTML structure of an element, Well, that's a breaking change, so it will be a bit more work, but still easy peasy. Just find all occurrences of an element in the template, change the structure, bump the style guide version, and you are done. So here Ella was working on shadows. And yeah, it was a minor change. Secondly, we were able to reuse it outside of the core platform in other existing and new projects. We used it for a corporate page, prototypes that we made during Hack Days, job posting template, internal CMS, etc. But to our surprise, style guide was also adopted by other teams. International team at Brainly started building small static websites in Canva, which is like a website builder, using style guide components. And in 2016, Brainly acquired a rival platform, OpenStudy, and their devs were tasked with making their platform look a bit more like ours. And since our style guide was open and pretty well documented, they did it completely without our help, saving everyone tons of time. Lastly, having an open, well-documented, and alive project sure makes you look good for potential candidates. So we made sure to link to it whenever we wrote a job posting. At this point, I hope I convinced you that having a style guide might be a good idea and a good investment. Now, how many of you, though, have seen like zombie style guides? So one that haven't been updated in some time, so it's now completely useless. Yeah, OK, right. Yeah, so I know I've seen quite a few, and I was a bit surprised after 3 years that our style guide is still somehow running. And it has like over 600 releases. As I said, 3 years. So how did we make it? Well, we actually haven't asked this question over those 3 years. I started thinking about it just recently and came up with a couple of tips. So first of all, it was a team effort. It wasn't like a task force that was working on a style guide. Whole front end was working on a style guide. I understand this. In big companies, this may not make much sense, but we were like 5 or 6 people back then, so we could easily all engage with building it. So everyone built a connection with the project. It was also open source from the day one, so we kind of wanted to make it look good so it makes us look good outside. We made it easy to use, and that's probably the most important tip. We had docs from the day one that described, showed the components, and we kept improving it over time. We had easy to remember domain, always showing the latest docs, and we had a continuous delivery hooked up, so it's easy to deploy. In other words, we strived to make the whole thing as easy to use and work with as possible. Oh, yeah. So here are some docs, how to hook it up. And above, you can see some groups of the components that I mentioned before. After some time, we added search because it grew so much that we needed search. After which, we also added ability to easily just copy and paste code. So you just click on the component you like, you copy the HTML, and you are done. And after we moved to React, or started supporting React rather, we created this interactive thing, which is just fun to play with. And what you can do here is you can specify what you need, and then just grab JSX or HTML code. The last tip that I have is that we actually had a process. And this sounds really boring, but I think that it was also like a huge, made a huge impact on us keeping the style guide alive. This process was in place to make sure that all new components, because we were getting new features, so new components were appearing, or component variations, so example, new color of the button, that they end up in the style guide. And yeah, we also had a process for removing stuff. So when we saw that something is no longer used and the only feature that had it was removed, we also removed it from the style guide. There's also one other factor that I think helped us, and this is just a thought, not an actionable tip for many of you here. We are working on a product. We are not a software house where projects are often passed to the client, never to be seen again. So we knew that all improvements we make today will pay off tomorrow, and all the mess that we'll make today will kick us in the back tomorrow. I probably made it sound like Style Guide solved all of our problems, and once we had it, our lives were a breeze. Well, not quite. One of the biggest pains we had to deal with every day was the fact that we communicated with design team through JPEGs. And yeah, as you know, and I think you will all agree, this is like a terrible medium for so-called developer handoff. Static images simply don't convey enough information to let us do our jobs as front-end devs. So, among other things, they don't tell us how design should look on different screens or screen sizes. And even if designers give us a mobile and desktop view, what happens in between? JPEGs tell us nothing about states of elements, so how should that input look when it's selected? They tell us nothing about how things should animate. Not everything should be as statically boring as on the design. And they don't explain what should happen if the lorem ipsum text is longer or placeholder image bigger than the one used on the design. So on the top of that, we had another problem. We had to manually figure out, just by looking at each design, which of the style guide components it consists of. Because you see, our style guide was made by the front-end team. It's not always the case. In fact, from what I know now, today, it's usually not the case. Usually, the design team starts the style guide. Style guides, in an ideal scenario, and we only realized that after 3 years, style guides should be created as a collaboration between both teams. Ours wasn't endorsed by design team anyway. The name we named things, grouped them, and thought of them was not in pair with how design team saw things. Whenever design of a new feature came, it was on front-end's shoulders to figure out which components it consists of, and if any of those are actually new. It was also our job, as I mentioned before, to figure out if a given component is no longer used and should be removed. What's even worse, designs that we were getting were often a mashup of old designs, screenshots from the website, and hand-drawn things. I think it sounds familiar for many of you. Elements there often didn't match anything we had in the style guide. So we had to bug the designers a lot by asking, did you maybe meant that button instead of what you draw? Did you mean that shade of gray? Because this one is not in a style guide. Can we make this text a bit bigger so it matches something that we actually have? This was super annoying for both parties, but that's how we rolled. Ideally, and if we were in sync with design, everyone would just know what design consists of, and designers would be able to tell us, oh yeah, that's a secondary dark button in a mint box with the border. And If we use the same language, it would be so much simpler. So we started thinking how we can improve what we have, how we can make the style guide more useful to the designers, how we can make them involved with our process. Those questions started my quest into the scary world of design systems and design tooling. First thing I learned about the tooling is that the days of Photoshop seem to be over, at least for UI designers. The new king was Sketch, made by a Dutch company, Bohemian Coding, and this made me very happy. As you know, and as the name suggests, Photoshop was never meant for UI design. Sketch, on the other hand, is meant for exactly that. Additionally, it's cheaper, lighter, easier to use, has a JavaScript-based plugin system, and this is a big one, open format. Sketch was a massive hit, and it created rich, innovative community and environment. Last time I checked, they had over 500 different plugins created by devs and designers from around the world. I'm pretty sure that the open format and choice of JavaScript as a plugin language helped this ecosystem flourish. Intrigued by Sketch, I attended my first design conference connected with a Sketch plugin hackathon. It was really refreshing not to hear about JavaScript frameworks for 5 minutes, that's for sure. It was a design tooling conference organized by Sketch folks, where I got to learn about other companies and tools complementing or competing with Sketch. Let me show you a couple of those to bring you into the speed. So this is Zeppelin, and it provides a better way to hand off designs to developers. It's exported from Sketch, but as a developer, I can measure all the things. I can pull the exact color values. I can pull exact font sizes and font face names. So yeah, and this is a web app, so web apps are pretty great, obviously. Abstract is another handy tool for designers that kind of blew my mind. It's basically a Git for designers. You get to the branches, pull requests, and pull request reviews. They are even called that. You also get merge conflicts, but it's all packed in a way that makes it understandable and intuitive to humans, unlike command line Git. The only missed opportunity in Abstract, to me, seems to be the fact that it's an incompatible fork of Git, so you can't host your designs alongside your code, unfortunately. I really hope that GitHub or GitLab will see designers as their next big market and improve their tools with that group in mind. Finally, there is InVision that started as a platform for prototyping. So with InVision, designers can make their static designs into dynamic prototypes. Later, InVision expanded their offering by providing a developer handoff solution similar to Zeppelin that I showed at the beginning, and a graphics editor similar to Sketch. At this point, I should probably also mention that Sketch also expanded their offering and now includes tools for prototyping. So all these companies suddenly started to step on each other's toes. But InVision is not the only Sketch competitor. The other big one is Figma. Figma solves the versioning problem Google Docs style. Similar to Zeppelin, it's a web app, but unlike Zeppelin, it's a full-blown graphic editor in the browser with a real-time collaboration built in. Even more excitingly, Figma has an API that lets you interact with the designs programmatically. It's also worth noting that core of Figma, since we are on a front-end conference, front-end design conference, runs on WebAssembly. And I think it's like first big commercial use that I saw in practice. And it runs incredibly smoothly. And yeah, it's just great to see that you just can port Sketch to the browser. Being a web app gives Figma also a huge advantage over Sketch because it makes Figma platform independent, unlike Sketch, which is macOS only. Web apps are pretty great. Who knew? There's also Framer, another Dutch product, and UXPin from Poland, but I'll talk about those later. Adobe, to their credit, realized what's going on and created from scratch in record time their own response to Sketch. It's called Adobe XD, which always makes me think about the smiley emoji for some reason. In an attempt to regain the market, they are offering a free starter version. So it's a pretty good deal for those who are just starting their design adventure. Phew. So that's how the design tooling landscape looks from my perspective. And I know I haven't mentioned even half of the tools that are out there, but it's really hard to keep up right now. Compared to the current evolution of design tooling, front-end tooling and framework landscape feels like it's standing in place. Shocking, I know, but maybe we're just getting old. After exploring the tooling, I decided to spend some time to better understand how our design team operates. It turned out that design team had quite a lot of documentation, not always as up-to-date as our style guide, but still quite useful. One of the oldest, but still relevant docs was the brand book. Brand books predate the internet. They specify and standardize use of logo, fonts, company colors, including Pantone colors, which are useful for printing, and some other applications beyond web and apps. They are still useful to this day, and they are still being produced to this day, but in the digital era, they are simply not enough. By the way, I also learned, and probably designers know about this, but it was new to me. I also learned that the term branding comes from marking the cattle, which now makes me a bit uncomfortable when I put on my gym shirt with a huge sports company logo. So brand books were not enough, and that's where designers moved to UI kits. UI kits are sets of reusable elements, like buttons, inputs, that designers use to save some time and build consistent designs. In some UI kits, you will also find bigger elements built out of the smaller ones, like whole dialog boxes or even pages. You might be wondering what happens when a basic component changes. Do designers have to update all these bigger components? Well, no, they kind of figured it out. They have something called symbols. So now I created a gray rectangle symbol, and I will kind of reuse it a couple of times. It's kind of boring, sorry, I'm not a designer. And yeah, you can see that. So yeah, here and now I'll modify the master symbol, and voila, like everything else is also updated. Like, objects and instances of objects. This probably rings a couple of bells. At this point, it hit me. Like, our style guide and their UI kit, pictured side by side, are the same thing. They are even using the same idea of components that we see in React, Vue, Angular, web components, whatever. The benefits of making UI kit and style guide into one would redefine how front-end and design cooperate. I wasn't the first to realize that, unfortunately. There already was react-sketchapp built by AirBnB that was bridging the gap between code and design by providing ability to render React components in Sketch. So excited, I started tinkering with it. Unfortunately, it quickly became obvious that react-sketchapp requires you to have a very specific configuration of your project. First, you need to have React. This was true to us, true for us, but it's probably not true for all other teams. Secondly, you had to build like your most basic components with so-called generic components. So basically, view, text, and image. You are not allowed to use HTML tags, which our style guide unfortunately did. Lastly, you have to use CSS in JS. That, besides being controversial, also wasn't true for us. So clearly, we were not able to use react-sketchapp directly, but it did inspire us, or it did inspire me, to try build a framework-agnostic solution. So how do you start building something like that? Well, I started by drawing a rectangle in Sketch, like another rectangle, sorry, saving it as a Sketch file and inspecting that file. Because you see, I mentioned before that Sketch was revolutionary in a way that it had an open format. And what I mean by open format, when you save a Sketch file, you just have to change its extension from .sketch to .zip, and then you can just unpack it. And inside, you will find some images and JSON files. And those we can understand. But by looking at those JSON files, I was quickly able to figure out where background color, width, height, and position of that rectangle that I drew went. So here you can see position. Here is the color. It's different format than what we use on the web, but we can translate that. Now, from the other side, we are in the browser. I sure can create a JSON files with JavaScript, so this part is no problem. But how do I get positions of all elements that I want to extract? Well, there is an API for that. It's called getBoundingClientRect in this picture here. And it gives you exact absolute position of given DOM node. Adds DOM traversal mechanism to that, generate JSON object replicating the sketch file, and you get this. I used Twitter profile card as a test subject. You can see the original thing on the right, running in the browser, and my first attempt at rendering in Sketch on the left. You could probably figure it out yourself. OK, so that's a pretty solid start, but now I need backgrounds, borders, opacity, shadows, and all other goodness that CSS provides. How do we fetch those? So there is another API for that in the browser called getComputedStyle that gives us computed, so let's say final values of given DOM element. We can hook that up to our DOM traversal solution, gather the data, figure out how they are stored in Sketch, and make the translation. Sometimes translation wasn't as straightforward as it sounds. For example, Sketch does not support one-side browsers, so we had to fake those by using Sketch shadows. Thankfully, Sketch does support multiple shadows. We also had to find out which of those rectangles that I showed you before are visible and which of them are not. And unfortunately, there is no good API in the browser for that. In CSS, if CSS display property is set to none, it's obvious. But there are so many different ways you can make a DOM node not to appear on the screen. So, for example, you can check the size of the element. But even if it's 0, you still have to check the overflow property, and if it's not hidden, then you cannot be sure that element is actually hidden. And even if you are convinced that given element is visible, you still have to go up and check all of its parents to see if one of those parents is not hidden. Here you can see a nasty edge case where element is clipped by its parent. After many small battles like those, I got this. Definitely a progress over just a bunch of rectangles, but we definitely need text and images here. Unfortunately, back then, text part of this Sketch format was not really open. I was expecting Sketchfile to describe text like this, but instead of that, I got that. So this is a binary blob created by serializing some Objective-C class. Objective-C, because that's the language Sketch is written in, and that's why it's macOS only. By the way, I met the creator of Sketch, original creator of Sketch, and I asked him the obvious question, why macOS only, and he said, well, I only had Mac back then, so what could I do? Very smooth. So I couldn't easily generate that from JavaScript. Fortunately, it turned out that Sketch plugins can generate those blobs, so Sketch plugins. Because you see, I kind of lied to you. Sketch plugins are not written in JavaScript. They are written in Cocoa script. So Cocoa is an object-oriented native API for macOS. And Cocoa script is JavaScript with access to Cocoa objects. It's really... You didn't want to know this, sorry. That's the one way you can use it. It even has it even uses Objective-C syntax, so it's kind of strange. But fortunately, there is another option where it looks a bit more human, although still a bit messy. So here, for example, NS Pasteboard and NS Alert are system-native elements of macOS. With help of native Cocoa APIs, I could get text to work. So more progress. Images also turned out to be tricky. JavaScript doesn't have access to images coming from different domains, so I also offloaded that to the plugin, which doesn't run in the browser, so it's not restricted by the browser security policy. Finally, I was able to get this. Yeah, so here it's switched for some reason, but since it's the same now, it doesn't really matter. Although my initial plan was to generate valid sketch files with JS only, problems with font, images, and a couple others made me use a Sketch plugin. Having plugin forced me to create an intermediate format, one that JavaScript can build, but it cannot be really understood by Sketch directly. It has to go through the plugin. Despite the small issue, HTML-SketchUp turned out to work pretty well. And we were able to export our whole style guide to Sketch. And that's how the end product looks. So we have symbols which represent all the components. We have shared text styles. We have colors, also like main colors pulled from our style guide and put into Sketch. And here we can see it in action. Again, I was the designer, so sorry. And it just shows you how easy it is to build something with those components. Yeah, so that's a really simple one. Oh, and you have overrides. This is kind of a think about overrides as a properties on the React components. So, for example, I was able to change text. Anyway, designers really value consistency, and having this kind of integration was making sure that components they use in designs will look exactly the same as on production. This prototype eventually helped us to form an official cross-functional design system team. What's a design system? Well, there are many definitions, but at Brainly we saw it as a super category that includes brand book, UI kit, style guide, but also a couple of other things. For example, tone of voice, so how your company talks to their users. Animation guidelines, PowerPoint slide templates, company swag guidelines, etc. So like everything design related, it seems. Design system should also be should also describe the processes of adding and removing UI components. A much bigger topic than the style guide alone, and something useful to the whole company, not only designers and devs. From the design conference I attended, I know that big companies like Facebook or BRB have design systems for quite some time now, and you should definitely check out what they built. They presented some of their stuff on that conference, and well, it was just mind-blowing, a bit depressing also. Like they had a team of 100 people working on something I tried to do alone. So yeah, but it was inspiring. Let's call it inspiring. I also learned that there is even a special job title for folks who work on design engineering solutions. It's called Design Ops, or DevOps in short. So yeah, you can now update your LinkedIns. Design system team started by taking a closer look at the style guide components we exported and fixing inconsistencies between elements. For example, standardizing the shadows, what again Ella did in one pull request. The process that we established for making changes in those components was rather simple. Designers let us know about all the changes they want to make. For example, changes to the shadow or a new variation of a button. Front end picks up the task, makes the changes in the style guide. Style guide is exported automatically to Sketch using html-sketchapp and a headless browser, and designers get back the updated library. There is even a very neat feature in Sketch that helped us to make sure that everyone is getting new version of the export. It basically syncs everyone with the same library. We have design team on board. We even got a proper logo, and I got to polish the code and spend some time growing the community. And HTML-SketchUp, which was an open source project from day one, did get quite a lot of traction. We got collaborators from around the world, and teams at Microsoft, Yelp, and Seek started using it. So yeah, I was a bit shocked because they actually, and again, this was a bit depressing because they were moving faster than we were with the product that we made. So yeah, for those who are using Storybook, Chris Villa created an integration that lets you easily export your existing Storybook components to Sketch using HTML-SketchUp. All of that was extremely cool to see. That being said, we eventually did hit some limitations of Sketch, and this system didn't standardize some of the stuff that I haven't mentioned before conveniently. So it didn't standardize, for example, paddings and margins, which are a big part of making things consistent. In fact, we didn't have any grid system in our style guide, which was a huge headache and something I would definitely change if we started over. But the design system team at Brainly is still going strong, so I'm sure they will overcome those issues eventually. While on the design system team, I got some time to prototype ideas for the future that our style guide integration had opened. So one of the ideas was to create a tooling that we can use between both teams. So here you have this system level tool that where you can pick an element and bang, you put it in your code. It doesn't depend. It doesn't matter what editor you are using. But here, even better, you can put it directly in Sketch. It kind of detects what is the tool you are pasting to and pastes the right thing. Other thing, better developer handoff, because now, since designers are building those things with components, we can finally get back, quickly get back information of what components they had actually used. So here I have some kind of a design that I made using our components. And here we can see that I can just select an element and immediately see what this element is, and I can get its source code. ability to pick code from the fact that HTML-SketchUp runs in the browser also allowed us to experiment with putting it just into the style guide. So remember, I showed you this ability to quickly copy the code from like HTML code or JSX code from our style guide. Well, we wanted to do something very similar for designers. So here, I'm on CodePen. I will change like text of this button for some reason, because this is like, you won't see that. It's red now. And immediately, you will get like code to copy that you can paste into HTML-SketchUp, and bang, you get the element. So right from the website to Sketch. And well, at some point, I also thought, well, I should probably make a Sketch browser. And so I did. It's like a functioning browser inside of Sketch. It doesn't make much sense, but it was fun to build. That's when I left Brainly, but I know that their design team is doing great, and I hope some of the prototypes that I showed you will come to life. That being said, do you remember how I mentioned before that design tooling is moving really fast? So image-based tools like Sketch or Figma are cool, but Framer and UXPin both work on some next-level stuff, currently in beta? I don't know. They are promising tooling that will allow designers to work directly on code. So no translation needed, no developer handoff needed. Those tools will consume existing production React components and produce React code. That's incredibly powerful, but no, front-end devs don't have to be afraid for their jobs just yet. Someone still has to organize that code and hook up the business logic. The days of manually translating designs into code might be finally over, though. That's all I've got. I hope I inspired some of you to take a closer look at the design engineering collaboration at your organization, and maybe take a stab at improving it. And if you will, you may even call yourself a DevOps. Thank you so much.